In 1958, the science fiction film The Blob terrified audiences with an amorphous creature that never stopped growing, swallowed everything in its path, and could not be destroyed. Half a century later, people living around Caddo Lake witnessed a real-life version of it. Caddo Lake is the only large natural lake in Texas and an internationally recognized wetland. But its open water was disappearing. The creeks that once carried fishermen, tourists, and duck hunters deep into the cypress forest had become sealed beneath a thick green carpet. Roy Dupree, who had been boating there for more than 20 years, said fish had completely disappeared from many areas. John Sanders was not a seasoned expert. He was simply a local resident who had spent his entire life around Caddo Lake and refused to stand by as the lake slowly died. Sanders bought an aquatic plant harvester with his own money and brought it onto the lake. The city of Marshall later provided $25,000 to support his efforts. The machine operated for about 10 straight days, but the attempt failed. The plant doubled the area it covered. In the end, what finally defeated it were 200,000 insects, no larger than sesame seeds, along with one of the fish species Americans hate most. This plant is known as giant Salvinia. It comes from Brazil and is an invasive species in the United States. To understand why giant Salvinia is so difficult to stop, begin with the strangest fact about it. It cannot produce seeds, and yet it has spread through waterways across 5 continents and become one of the worst aquatic weeds on Earth. Nature has given it something that other species do not have, the ability to clone itself. Each plant is made up of clusters of small leaves connected by an underwater stem. Any fragment that breaks off can grow into an entirely new plant. Under favorable conditions, a mat of giant Salvinia can double in size in just 3 days. And that is exactly what happened in the United States. But Caddo Lake was not the first place where this happened. That was Toledo Bend Reservoir, located along the Texas-Louisiana border. By the time people realized how serious the problem had become, the invasion was already spreading rapidly. A single fragment of Salvinia can split into 2, then 4, then 8. Wind, waves, currents, and boats continue carrying it farther. In Louisiana, an infestation that covered less than 400 acres in 1999 eventually expanded to more than 70,000 acres. At Caddo Lake, the affected area grew from less than 100 acres to 11 times that size in just 1 year, before exceeding 3,000 acres by 2009. The plants grew into dense, tangled mats that made it impossible for boats to move. In a place like Caddo, where much of life depends on fishing and boating, a lake sealed beneath vegetation is not just an ecological problem. It can also bring an entire way of life to an end. The mats can look like solid grass, causing people and animals to accidentally step into the water. They also create breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Beneath the surface, they block sunlight and drain oxygen from the water. Research in Texas found that dissolved oxygen levels fell by a factor of 2.5. Native underwater plants slowly died in the darkness, and fish populations reportedly declined by 90%. The people of Caddo Lake were not willing to give up on their lake. They stretched floating booms across waterways to corral the drifting mats of Salvinia. They sent harvesting machines onto the water and sprayed herbicides across thousands of acres. But this plant came equipped with its own defense system. Each leaf is covered with thousands of tiny hairs whose tips join together like miniature egg beaters. They trap a layer of air, making the leaf surface almost completely waterproof. Water rolls right off the leaves, and herbicides have a hard time sticking to them. In June 2009, 5 spray boats were deployed across Caddo Lake, treating nearly 1,000 acres in less than 2 weeks. Even using powerful EPA-approved herbicides, biologist Howard Elder said the treatment achieved only about 90% control after 7 to 10 days. For most weeds, 90% would be considered a victory. But with giant Salvinia, the remaining 10% is all it takes to trigger the next devastating invasion. There was another problem. You simply cannot keep spraying herbicides across 26,000 acres of cypress wetlands year after year. The legal restrictions and the cost alone make that impossible. So why not drain the lake and let the plants dry out? That had already been tried. Lowering the water level only killed the mats stranded on exposed ground. Plants hidden in deep channels and flooded forests survived and eventually spread again. This is the challenge behind almost every invasive species story. A determined invader, a landscape too vast and too complex to control by force alone, and a plant that can return from a single surviving fragment. Now, let us think more simply. Instead of relying on projects imposed by humans, what if we let nature solve the problem itself? More specifically, what if we use the plant's natural enemy? Scientists returned to giant Salvinia's native range in South America. In Brazil, the plant grows like any other species because it is kept under control by insects that evolved alongside it over millions of years. Historical surveys recorded dozens of insect and mite species living on Salvinia, but scientists could not simply move all of them to another continent. Species that fed on many different plants were ruled out because they could become new pests themselves. Species that caused too little damage would not be strong enough to stop the invasion. In the end, the most promising candidate was Certobagus salviniae, a shiny black weevil only about 2 millimeters long, smaller than a sesame seed. This was not an impulsive decision. In 1980, Australia's CSIRO released a Brazilian strain of the weevil into Lake Mundara, where more than 50,000 tons of salvinia covered the water. About 15 months later, the plant mats had almost completely collapsed. Adult weevils feed on the growing buds, while their larvae tunnel through the underwater stems, cutting off the flow of nutrients. The salvinia turns brown, loses its ability to float, and eventually sinks to the bottom. That success was later repeated in many other countries. According to CSIRO, the weevil has been released in at least 20 countries. Results from 17 of them showed effective control within approximately 1 to 5 years. It also helped reopen areas that had been blocked by salvinia throughout the Sepik River system in Papua New Guinea. The only question left was whether it could do the same thing in a Texas wetland. But wait, there is one important detail we need to pause and consider. In fact, they did not necessarily have to import another insect species because a weevil capable of feeding on this plant was already present in the United States. The USDA recorded Certobagus salviniae in Florida as early as around 1960, living on common salvinia or Salvinia minima. There, the plant usually grew in scattered patches, very different from the dense mats that later exploded across Louisiana. Later studies suggested that the Florida weevil population may have been quietly feeding on the plant's buds, tunneling into its stems, and suppressing salvinia for decades. However, scientists at the time did not yet fully understand how effective the Florida strain could be. For that reason, later control programs continued to favor the larger Brazilian strain of the weevil. Beginning in the 2000s, scientists from Texas A&M AgriLife, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and Louisiana State University began releasing Salvinia weevils into Caddo Lake and at 2 sites on Lake Texana. Each site initially received only about 220 weevils. 3 years later, another release involved more than 104,000. By fiscal year 2016, Texas Parks and Wildlife and its partners had released 713,993 weevils across 5 lakes in East Texas, including Caddo Lake. In 2019 alone, about 200,000 more were released as part of the statewide program. But during the first few months, almost nothing seemed to happen. The lake's surface remained covered in thick green vegetation. The weevils needed time to lay eggs, mature, and increase from thousands of individuals to hundreds of thousands, and eventually millions. Adult weevils concentrate on feeding on young buds, leaving small holes in the leaves, but the most serious attack takes place below the surface. The larvae burrow into the rhizomes, the structures that connect the leaf clusters and transport nutrients, and hollow out the plant tissue from the inside. Once weevil numbers become high enough, entire mats of salvinia begin to change color. Green turns to yellow, then brown. Damage to the stems allows the leaves to absorb water, lose their buoyancy, and sink. The University of Florida reported that assessments in Texas and Louisiana found that the weevils could reduce salvinia coverage by more than 99% at favorable sites. But what if they became invasive themselves, like feral hogs or Burmese pythons? Scientists say that is extremely unlikely. The weevil is considered a relatively safe biological control agent. Tests have shown that it uses only plants in the genus Salvinia. In North America, its food sources are giant Salvinia and common Salvinia, both of which are non-native plants. It is not a generalist plant eater that can switch to rice fields or native vegetation. When given another plant species, it will starve rather than begin feeding on it. The weevil spends its entire life on this aquatic fern, but a single weevil can do something a bulldozer cannot. It can create more weevils. Where there were once only thousands, there were soon hundreds of thousands, and then millions. Slowly at first, and then rapidly, the Salvinia mats began to change color and disappear. In 2017, giant Salvinia covered more than 5,300 acres of Caddo Lake. Another Texas report estimated that the infestation exceeded 6,000 acres at its peak. By early 2019, that figure had fallen to just over 1,500 acres. At favorable sites in Texas and Louisiana, the results were even more dramatic. The USDA reported that Salvinia covered only about 1% of the water surface at sites where weevils had been released, while untreated control sites remained completely covered. Biomass fell from more than 100 tons of fresh plant material per acre to less than 2 tons, exposing most of the open water again. But releasing weevils does not guarantee success. Early efforts in Texas made that clear. A 2005 report found that weevil populations released at B.A. Steinhagen Reservoir did not appear to establish stable breeding populations. At this point, we have to accept that although the method can be highly effective, it is not perfect. It still has one major weakness. The weevils cannot tolerate cold temperatures. They come from a warm climate. When prolonged freezes sweep across Caddo Lake, weevil populations can collapse before they have enough time to reproduce. At Cross Lake and Lake Bistineau, LSU's Seth Johnson said control was only seasonal. In 3 of the 5 winters monitored, low temperatures eliminated or nearly eliminated the entire weevil population. As a result, local residents and scientists had to build winter shelters for the very insects being used as biological control agents. In 2010, Texas A&M funded a weevil rearing greenhouse at the Caddo Lake National Wildlife Refuge. A community organization made up of local residents, businesses, and government agencies, known as the Caddo Lake Biocontrol Alliance, built greenhouses along the lakeshore and began actively raising weevils. They grew giant Salvinia in shallow tanks, released weevils onto the plants, and kept them alive throughout the winter where the cold could not reach them. Then, every spring, they released a new generation back into the lake. The first facility was used mainly for research. By 2014, a larger production greenhouse had been built in uncertain Texas and was operated by the Caddo Biocontrol Alliance. The goal for 2015 alone was to release about 165,000 weevils. That may sound like a large number, but Texas Parks and Wildlife estimated that nearly 650,000 adult weevils would be needed to control just 1 acre of Salvinia growing in a single layer. That meant the greenhouse could not deliver an instant victory. It could only help people rebuild the army after every winter. Not every location faces the same problem. Farther south, where winters are milder, the weevils can survive the cold on their own. Release them once, and they can establish a population, survive the winter, and continue working year after year without the need for a greenhouse. In some southern lakes, a single release of a moderate number of weevils can provide long-term control. A small effort can produce a large and lasting result. Caddo Lake is simply unlucky enough to sit along the cold edge of the weevils' range. It is close enough to the freeze line for the insects to win during the summer, but not far enough south for them to reliably survive the winter. The boundary on the map between release them and never return and raise them forever runs directly through this part of the country. On a vast natural lake like Caddo, the weevil is the only solution that can be scaled up across such a large area. But in smaller, more enclosed bodies of water, such as private ponds or isolated reservoirs, managers use a second and completely different supporting species. When the weevil army cannot survive the cold winters, managers still have a backup option, but it involves introducing another non-native species. Grass carp, scientifically known as Catenopharyngodon idella, are native to Asia and are classified by Texas as a potentially harmful exotic species. They are often grouped under the broad label Asian carp, which makes many Americans wary, even though they are not the silver carp known for leaping out of the water and crashing into boats. Unlike a weevil that measures only 2 millimeters long, a grass carp can become a living plant-eating machine. It swims continuously through a pond, biting and swallowing soft underwater vegetation without fuel, an operator, or repeated spraying. However, releasing fertile grass carp into an open river system would create exactly the problem the project is trying to avoid: a non-native species capable of establishing a new population. The solution is the triploid grass carp. Hatcheries treat fertilized eggs so the fish develop 3 sets of chromosomes instead of 2. This imbalance makes them functionally sterile. The U.S., Fish and Wildlife Service also tests the amount of DNA in the cells to confirm that each batch is truly triploid before the fish can be transported. They still eat and grow normally, but they cannot produce another generation. In Texas, residents cannot simply buy a few fish and release them into a lake. Possessing, transporting, and stocking them all require permits. The fish must come from a licensed supplier and carry triploid certification. TPWD generally recommends about 5 fish per acre when vegetation covers no more than half the water body, and up to about 10 fish per acre when coverage is heavier. It may take several years before the results become clear, and additional fish are often needed after about 5 to 7 years. But grass carp are not a perfect solution for giant Salvinia. A controlled Texas A&M study was the first to confirm that triploid grass carp actually consume this plant. Young fish ate Salvinia at a moderate rate and may be useful when an infestation is still new, the plants are tender, and the mats have not yet formed multiple dense layers. Once the mats become mature, tough, and thickly stacked across the surface, their ability to control the plant declines sharply. The study concluded only that grass carp may play a limited supporting role. They cannot replace weevils, herbicides, or mechanical removal across a massive system like Caddo Lake. Risks remain even when the fish are sterile. Grass carp do not perfectly distinguish invasive plants from native vegetation. If too many are released, they can strip away submerged plant beds that provide young fish with shelter and feeding habitat. They also tend to follow flowing water and escape from ponds. Even though they cannot reproduce, escaped fish can still damage vegetation in places where they were never intended to be used. For that reason, TPWD requires many water bodies to have screens or barriers that prevent the fish from escaping. As you know, the success of this project is not measured by how many weevils or fish were released into the water. It becomes visible when the ecosystem begins functioning again. As the Salvinia mats gradually disappeared, the most important changes took place beneath the surface. Sunlight began penetrating the water again, giving native aquatic plants a chance to recover in areas that had once been completely shaded. These plants form the foundation of the ecosystem because they provide food, shelter, and breeding habitat for small fish, aquatic insects, and water birds. Dissolved oxygen levels also began to rise again, and that change was critical. When Salvinia covered the lake's surface, it blocked the exchange of air. Then, as tons of plant material died and decomposed, microorganisms consumed even more of the remaining oxygen, leaving the water suffocating for fish and many other organisms. As native plants, plankton, and aquatic insects recovered, young fish gained more food and places to hide. In turn, the habitat needed by familiar sport fish in Caddo Lake, including bass and crappie, gradually began to return. At the surface, waterways that had once been sealed shut began to open again. Boats could leave the docks, fishermen returned to their old fishing spots, and visitors could once again travel deep into the cypress forest. In the end, Caddo Lake was not saved by a machine, a chemical, or a single animal species. Harvesters could open only narrow channels through the vegetation. Herbicides weakened the mats, but they had to be applied repeatedly. Salvinia weevils could turn hundreds of acres of the plant brown and send it sinking beneath the surface, but winter cold reduced their populations. Triploid grass carp were suitable only for smaller, enclosed bodies of water under strict control. Giant Salvinia has not disappeared completely, but through a combination of machinery, herbicides, biological control, weevil-rearing greenhouses, and community involvement, large areas of open water have returned. Boats can move through the lake again, local residents have returned to fishing, and the cypress trees are once more reflected on the water. This story shows that nature is rarely repaired with a single simple solution. When humans move a species outside the ecosystem that once kept it under control, the consequences can last for decades. And sometimes, real victory does not mean completely eliminating an invader. It means keeping it below the point where it can destroy everything. What do you think? Is using one non-native species to control another a smart solution or a dangerous gamble? Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel to continue exploring more remarkable stories from the natural world.